Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the fourth and final webinar from the Financing Coordination Group. My name is Michael Sadowski. I'm the Executive Director of the Circulate Initiative, and I will be your host on today's webinar. Um, just, um, just to give you some context, the Circulate Initiative, which is a nonprofit working to address plastic pollution and build equitable and circular emerging economies, is one member of the Financing Coordination Group, and the FCG, as we will call it, is an informal initiative that comprises TCI, UNEP FI, World Bank Group, the OECD, and the World Economic Forum that is aiming to improve the overall understanding of the finance landscape for addressing plastic pollution and to also catalyze additional investment in plastic pollution. If you've joined the prior three webinars, you would have heard subject matter experts talk about the significant amount of funding that's needed to address plastic pollution. It's a lot. It's up to $1 trillion per year out to 2040. You would also know that we've got a ways to go to hit that number. We know roughly $32 billion of private money is being invested per year based on our data, so we have quite a gap. And so during this webinar, we're going to take a look at what can we do to really accelerate investment in plastic circularity. And we'll hear from a number of speakers really about practical things like the policy environment, infrastructure, human capital, other enablers that will help ratchet up investment in the circular economy. We use the word investment in this webinar, and this is a broad term that means, investment in multiple forms, loans, equity stakes, grants, funding that addresses plastic pollution. Some of these forms of capital are better suited to different solutions than others, and we will talk about that. So if you can advance the slide as a please for me. Just some housekeeping items. In terms of the agenda, well, if you go back one slide, apologies. We will hear from Elena Buzzi, who I'll introduce in a moment, to just give us a context setting set of remarks. We'll have a panel discussion, which I will introduce later. We'll have some time for Q&A, and then we will have closing remarks at the end. So housekeeping items, everyone is muted on this webinar. You can add questions to the Q&A chat box, and we will strive to answer them as we go through the webinar, and we also may pick out some for the Q&A session at the end. We will have a recording of this webinar and a summary report, that we will post online and share with participants. And if you have any additional questions, comments, ideas, you can share them with my colleague Shamina at the email address on this screen. Okay, so you've heard about me. And again, the goal of this session is to really dive into, I would say, the practical side. Like, what is it going to take to get investment flowing at the rate that we need? We know that we need a lot of capital to address this problem. And so on this webinar, we really want to understand what's it going to take. And so I think we're going to have Elena join us now. If you can flip the slide one more, please. So I just want to introduce Elena Buzzi, policy analyst for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. And we've asked Elena to just provide some context setting on the prior three FCG webinars, as well as the INC sessions to date. There's one more coming up in August of this year, and we thought it'd be good, context setting to allow Elena to just reflect on what's been done to date. So Elena, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this introduction, and greetings to all who are joining us today. So indeed, as Michael explained, this is the fourth in a series of 4 webinars organized by the Financing Coordination Group, FCG, that were really focused on financing considerations in the context of ongoing negotiations for a treaty on plastic pollution. The first 3 webinars that you see there on the screen already covered a wealth of topics, including options for a financial mechanism to be established within the treaty, but also broader strategies to mobilize and to align financial flows with the objectives of ending plastic pollution, as well as needs for financial and non-financial support to developing countries, including capacity building. So in my brief intervention here today, I'd like to try to set the stage for the panel discussion that will come later by providing an overview of some highlights and key themes that emerged from the speakers that we had at the previous webinars, and that we consider particularly important as we look into the resumed fifth session of INC in August, coming up in August in Geneva. So the context for all of this discussion is really that we know that it's feasible, that we can achieve the elimination of plastic pollution, that we can achieve this international goal, and that we can do so within a relatively rapid time frame. This has been said by a number of reports, including OECD reports and from others, that show that the implementation of ambitious policies along the life cycle of plastics could effectively eliminate plastic pollution quite rapidly. But as Michael already said, this will require a quite significant mobilization of resources from both public as well as private sources of funding. And now turning to the slide that I have there on the screen, if we look at what's happening in terms of private capital flows at the moment, we see that, first of all, there is a need to mobilize additional capital to make sure that the interventions that are required can be put in place, but also to make sure that it's being directed to where it's most needed. On the screen, I'm showing data from the analysis performed by the Circulate Initiative that's showing that the majority of private investments is currently really going to North America and Europe, while regions where the challenge of plastic pollution is most pronounced, such as emerging economies in Asia, Africa, and others, receive a much smaller share. So this really highlights an important gap that needs to be addressed. A second type of misalignment is also in terms of the types of activities that are being funded currently by private finance. The bulk of investments is flowing towards waste management, recovery and recycling, which of course are very critical interventions to reduce leakage to the environment and pollution. However, interventions such as reuse and refill models that are also important to reduce waste and pollution are receiving a much smaller share, less than 5% of current private financial flows. So this is just a brief overview of what's the current state of things. And now turning to the options for financing on the next slide. Thank you. A central issue in the ongoing negotiations is really the financing mechanism to be established within the treaty. Key points of discussions are, for instance, should there be the establishment of a dedicated fund, or if only for this treaty, or should we try to leverage on existing funds? Also, should the contributions to this fund be mandatory or voluntary, and what are the possible targets that we could envision? To try to inform these conversations, during past webinars, we invited speakers to present lessons learned from the experience of existing multilateral environmental agreements, like the Montreal Protocol, who expressed some views regarding some of the elements that they consider critical for a financial mechanism, including, for instance, needs to have stable and predictable funding, having mechanisms for accountability, and other elements. Regarding whether it's best to have a new fund, use an existing fund, or try to go for a hybrid solution. So one where we use an existing fund, but with a new mechanism. We discussed the advantages and disadvantages of all options, including by hearing opinions from the GEF and the World Bank. So all of these resources are available online, and the recordings are available for you to consult. But at the same time, in addition to the discussions on the financing mechanism, well, we recognize that a mechanism can only cover very specific actions and functions. So we also discussed at length what are the broader system-wide changes that will also be required in the financing landscape to put in place the ambition that could comprehensively end plastic pollution. And this brings me to my next slide. So in general, funding is needed for a range of interventions. Funding is needed for scaling up waste management infrastructure, particularly in some of the developing countries that currently do not have access to basic waste collection. But also for interventions all along the value chain, including for the establishment of circular business models, for innovation in material and product design, and also for the scale up of solutions such as reuse and refill systems. And while there are needs for financing in all countries, there is a recognition that developing countries face particular needs as well as particular challenges in accessing the required finance. Also, channeling financing to projects in developing countries can prove to be challenging in certain circumstances due to the high risks involved as well as the limited enabling conditions that are there. There is also an important need for non-financial, so technical support and technology transfer to go hand in hand with the provision of funding, as well as support for the development and improvement of an enabling policy framework that is favorable to investments in circular solutions. So in this context, official development assistance, ODA, is quite important and can play a critical role, particularly for de-risking investments and helping to mobilize additional finance. But ODA alone it's a very finite and limited resource. So it's important that it's well targeted to support interventions in countries that need it the most. And at the same time, to make sure that we can match the scale of the challenge of ending plastic pollution, we need to make sure that other sources are also mobilized, particularly from private finance. This is really a recurring message that we heard from many speakers. We need to make sure that we are catalyzing and aligning investments across the finance ecosystems, both through and alongside the financial mechanism, potential financial mechanisms to be established within the treaty. There are many possible ways on how to do that, and learning from the experience of financing also for other environmental goals. We know that unlocking additional capital will require the establishment of enabling environments as well as the use of innovative financing strategies. For instance, blended finance approaches can help to attract commercial investors by mitigating risks through partnerships. And also outcomes-based finance can also have an important role to play. So this is a financing structure where returns are based on the impact of projects on the ground rather than only on the financial performance. And these approaches can be very important to finance projects that have positive social and environmental impacts on the ground. And then lastly, the treaty under discussion also offers very important opportunities to align financial flows with the objectives of the future treaty. So opportunities to redirect investments from activities that are harmful to the environment or human health towards circular solutions that can bring benefits and help to achieve the objective of ending pollution. So to conclude, well, in this brief introduction, I could only touch on a very few highlights. I really invite you to explore the full set of insights from previous webinars via the recordings and the resources that are available on our website. I just want to say, as we now look towards the resumed session of negotiations in August, There are a number of key challenges and important discussions that remain outstanding, including, for instance, the lack of agreements on the design and governance of a financial mechanism and the specific funding sources and targets. But again, beyond the mechanism, we need to also put the attention on the rapid changes in the financing ecosystem that will need to be there and that are essential to accelerate the implementation of interventions to reduce plastic pollution. As I said, we know that aid alone will not be enough, and that success will depend on creating and fostering those enabling conditions for investments in circular solutions and mobilizing finance across all sources. We also hope that these discussions from past and also this webinar can help to highlight some of the significant investment opportunities that are available already for the private sector, including scaling circular business models, but also investing in emerging areas such as contributing to remediation efforts. With this, I conclude and I hand over to Michael and wish us all a good discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Elena, for that fantastic summary of where we've been. And just to note, you had shared some data on investment. As a preview, TCI has been working on 2024 data. And just to give you an early look, essentially the findings are quite similar. So we don't have enough money. It's not flowing to the right places, the places that need it most. And it's mostly flowing towards recovery, end-of-life solutions, and not the business models that we very much need. So you also mentioned channeling money to emerging markets can be challenging, right? The enabling conditions are not always there. And so in this panel discussion, we're going to talk about those topics. And so we'll transition to that. And really, this is the heart of the webinar. And I'm really excited about this. As I mentioned at the start, we've discussed in the prior webinars really about the capital that is needed. It's a big number, it's daunting. And in this discussion, we've got folks from across the circular economy ecosystem. We have investors, we have a brand, we have recyclers, we have a multilateral organization. And the goal from this session is to hear from them on the enabling conditions that will really help accelerate investment in solutions to plastic waste. And when I say enabling conditions, I mean things like policy and regulation, EPR, infrastructure, transportation, logistics, end markets, human capital, all of those conditions that really need to be in place to help investments flow and land in a good place. And so you can see names and titles on the screen, but just very briefly, we'll hear from Rob Kaplan from Circulate Capital, Marup Kangara from Sri Chakra, Polyplast, a recycler in India, Rajesh Ayapila from Coca-Cola, Julian Koimat from Polyrec, a recycler in Colombia, Rachel Ramsey from the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and Essa Batene from OECD. From UNEP FI, sorry, Essa. So super excited about this. And again, Q&A, the tab is open. So if you have questions as we go through this, please pop your questions in there and we will do our best to try to answer those in line as we go. But maybe starting with Rob to kick us off. So Circulate Capital is investing across a number of countries. And as you are looking for investment opportunities, I'd love to hear, what are the enabling conditions that you want to see in place in a country that could support your investment? And maybe if you can provide an example or two of those enabling conditions that are supportive of investment, or, what are some things that maybe are getting in the way that make you pause?
Well, thank you, Michael. It's an honor to be here on this panel. This is such an important conversation, especially as we lead into INC next month. And so also very excited to see so many of my partners and friends on the panel here as well. So looking forward to this conversation. At Circulate Capital, we invest across high growth markets in emerging markets. And our focus has been on investing in the private sector aspects of the system. Our capital, we have over 265 million US dollars of assets under management, and we're backed by leading corporations like the Coca-Cola Company, development finance institutions like IFC, Proparco, and leading private investors like Minderu and Builders Vision. And we work with them to partner and invest that capital in over 25 companies across South and Southeast Asia and now Latin America. And we're investing in both recycling value chains, which we'll talk mostly about today, but we are also investing in disruptive innovation like new materials and even hopefully reuse and refill someday. We see preventing plastic pollution as a system problem. And as a result, it requires system solutions. And when you're working at such a system level, enabling conditions are really critical because so much of what makes us successful is outside of the control of any individual player. And so that's really where the system and these key enablers that you're talking about are so critical. And so when we're looking at investing in a new market, there's several that are top of mind for us. The first is there an investable pipeline? Do we see a lot of existing recyclers that have an opportunity to scale, that haven't seen access to capital, that have been profitable for some time? That's a key factor for us. The second in a new market is what's the state of private equity and private investment experience and history? Is there evidence of exits? Are there other private investors who understand the market and what it takes to deploy in that region, in that market? And then a third area is public sector investment in collection. So collection is the hardest and most important part of the value chain in preventing plastic pollution and driving circular supply chains in the region, in emerging markets. Do you have the access in line of sight to the quality and quantity of feedstock, of waste plastic, of waste material that we need to convert into higher value? And a lot of that requires public sector investment. And so we really look to see what the state of that is. And then like the fourth and maybe most specific for this conversation is around policy. So policy enablers are really the number one thing that we're keeping a close eye on and thinking about how we can be more actively involved in those conversations moving forward. A key first one is food grade acceptance. So there's still a number of markets around the world where you can't use recycled plastic in food grade packaging. And so that is immediately a red flag for us because you're cutting off a huge part of the market. If you can't put this back in food packaging, that's one of the most important markets that we can access in the highest value markets for a recycler. So that is a key issue that we've seen resolved in a place like India, and Swaroop and Srishakar can talk about that. And then the other two areas around policy are extended producer responsibility, markets that have EPR in place and have been developing those EPR systems. That is just a really helpful resource for most of the recyclers that we work with. It helps them weather difficult times. It helps them scale faster. It's not something we depend on exclusively because you have to stand on your own 2 feet, but EPR can be critical enabler for many of the recyclers in our portfolio companies. And then the last big area that I'd cite that we've seen as really rocket fuel in 2 of our biggest markets is recycled content mandates and requirements by government. So we've seen this roll out in India, and we've seen this roll out in Colombia, 2 markets that we've invested a lot in. And when this happens, when government is saying we want to see a certain % of packaging using recycled material, it really drives a step change in how fast the systems can evolve and take advantage of that. And we see that almost as a demand cap for virgin. Right. So by requiring recycled material, you're essentially saying, well, then you can only use so much virgin material. You have to use recycled material. It's effectively a production cap in many ways, but it's done in a market-friendly way that I think a lot of stakeholders could get on board with. So it's something that drives a lot of impact on the ground. And when we see those types of policies being enabled, we know that we'll be able to deploy a lot more capital in those markets.
Fantastic. Rob, that's an amazing tee up for Swaroop and Julian later. But Swaroop, a question to you. I mean, Rob's already mentioned India, some of the policies that have been supportive of recycling and addressing plastic pollution. So, Obviously India has implemented a number of policies to address plastic waste, content mandates, EPR, et cetera. Can you speak to the importance of these policies in India for your business? And maybe a tricky question, like, are any of these more important than others, or are they equally important to you as you try to address plastic waste?
Thank you, Michael, for having me here. In fact, hello, everyone. So just I'm taking the kind of discussion further from Rob's idea on in terms of the policy, because I think in India, it has really played a major role in bringing in the real circular system in place. In terms of the mandate or the policy mandates that India has seen since 2016, so there has been a kind of rigor and the seriousness that comes from the regulators in terms of framing the policies, which initially mandated collections of plastic from the packaging waste, which is mandated on the producers, importers, and brand owners in the country. And the sequence and increase of, I would say, the mandate being put in to bring the recycled content into the system is, I would, much more aggressive in terms of the numbers that have been put in. So February 2022 was a time where Indian government has mandated that there should be certain recyclate usage, especially in the rigid plastics, with an aggressive content targets of going up to 60% of the consumption, which again technically means that there should be such product available in the market, and that also puts a huge stress in the recycling ecosystem.
Yeah.
Taking up a cue from there is what the necessity of all the recyclers to pick up the mandate and then bring that, take the demand in the right sense, and then build their capacities and systems, which is where the technology was one challenge and the finance was the second challenge. And the third, and also an important factor, which also needs to be taken in, is the kind of feedstock availability in terms of the quality that is expected. So looking at these three elements, what we see as this regulatory push has brought in recyclate availability in the country right now. I'm right now giving you the number to put some numbers in the perspective. So the rigid plastics availability in terms of PET alone in the country is close to 320,000 tons per annum. So that's the kind of production capacity which has been ramped up in the span of, let's say, 3 years, which started in 2022 to 2025. That technically means a regulatory push definitely allows allows the expansion of the recycling capacity. There has been a certain amount of fund which would have flown in to build these capacities as well. And most importantly, there's the will of the regulator to actually put this in place. So net, what we have seen in the country is that a regulatory push definitely helped in building the right recycling ecosystem, and there has been right investments coming in across the board from various investors. Although we are an investing company of Circulate, and most importantly, what we also see is there is also a brand acceptability to this product, because it also needs to go back into the similar packaging or the circular product usage, where the brands should acknowledge and then receive this product as a quality product and then bring it back into their supply stream or the usage stream. So net that what we see is the EPR landscape, or sorry, the policy landscape did help Indian recycling ecosystem to bloom in terms of the numbers and capacities, and that also mandates or brings in an additional stress in the system that more funds should flow in terms of technology, in terms of the bandwidth of the recyclers to expand, and also the brands to bring in the right approach in accepting the material. Over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, sir. That was fantastic. So I may come back to you later with a question about what shifted within regulators that got them comfortable and willing to make such ambitious commitments and laws. But Rajesh, Rob called recycled content mandates rocket fuel. which I think is a good term for this. And so India requires 30% recycled content for rigid packaging by 2025, and this goes to 60% by 2027. That seems incredibly ambitious and challenging, and would love to hear your thoughts as a brand that is implementing these requirements. Like, how has this influenced investment in India? And then what are some of the implications that you are seeing from a brand perspective and challenges as you think about getting to 60% recycled content?
Thanks, Michael, for having me here. I think it's a good segue that I'm speaking after Rob and Vijay.
Yeah.
Because we have two very important stakeholders. I think as they rightly pointed out, the regulations have panned out since some time, since 2016. And we have really seen a lot of investment coming into the recycling sector. At least as I last recall, as per the latest industry estimates, we have got an investment of close to around between 800 million to close to $1 billion as far as the recycling capacities are concerned. And in terms of capacities, we are looking at close to around 5 million tons per annum on the recycled PET content, which is coming up. So some of these capacities are already operational, some of these are upcoming. But in terms of the regulatory mandate of 30%, it's a mandate, so obviously brands are obliged to follow that mandate. But there are a couple of, I would say, challenges that any brand or any obligated entity would face. I think for year one, we do have some kind of a constraint in terms of the capacities that would be available. But I think that's going to level out as we go into the next 2 to 3 years. And I think the regulators have also been kind of like taking that into account while they have managed the latest amendments in the rules. But to your point of going up to 60%, I think that's going to be a challenge. There are a couple of factors which I think we will consider. Number one is obviously the price premium of rPET compared to virgin PET. Because at this point of time, while the market is still trying to adjust itself compared to the textile sector and the food grade application of rPET, so there is a bit of a price challenge which might become the cost of doing business at some point of time, but also might become a reality. But having said that, as capacities grow up, as the focus on rPET inclusion into food contact materials becomes more and more important, I feel at some point of time there is going to be a point of inflection where the food grade contact material might actually be at parity with the virgin PET material. But the final challenge in terms of the exceedingly high challenging numbers that the regulator has put in, like there is a 10% year-on increase leading up to 60%. If you look at that mathematically, it might not be a possibility at this point of time. So while we can continue to engage with our recycling partners as well as the regulators, this is something which we are taking up in those discussions, but we will see how things go forward on that. Thank you.
Rajesh, when we spoke, we also discussed yield as a critical piece, like getting better, cleaner streams of material into the system to be able to reach that. And obviously investment will support that as well.
Yeah, obviously, because currently I think the yields as we see are around 70%, which Vijay can confirm. Yeah. So if you do a mathematical calculation in terms of the 90% recycling rates, collection rates in India versus the 70% yield which we are getting to 60% appears mathematically impossible at this point of time. But, I think that's a discussion which we can have at a later year.
Amazing. Yep, great. And by the way, thank you for all the questions coming in. We're trying to answer them, some of them as we go through. A few folks have referenced the plastics treaty, and can folks speak to that? A few folks have referenced refill and reuse. We will get to that, so keep the questions coming. So maybe to Rachel, shifting from India to a different geographical context, so small island developing states that are your focused. Would love to hear a bit about like what the waste management and circular economy ecosystem looks like for the countries that the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund operates within. Are there examples of policies or financial mechanisms or other enablers that you think are having a discernible impact on plastic waste in the region?
Thank you so much, Michael. Hi, everyone. Good day. It's a real pleasure to be joining you for the discussions today. So considering some of the key enablers you would have brought up on the slide earlier, Michael, I'd like to start by speaking on policy and the regulatory framework in the region. So for us, it remains a bit fragmented, but it is evolving, and we are seeing emerging solutions such as EPR frameworks, the plastic waste bans, or deposit refund schemes gaining traction in the region. At the CARICOM level, this is our Caribbean Community Mechanism. There's work towards regional models, action plans, and there are also now regional conversations towards the INC 5.2 with talks about the need for regional EPR. For us, in terms of infrastructure and service provisions, waste collection remains okay in most urban areas. It's sound, but we do still have constraints impacting rural collection rates. There is an overall lack of sanitary engineered landfills, and several of our waste management sites, as we refer to them, are at or approaching capacity. In terms of recycling capacity, it's limited, but we do have several established or up-and-coming recovery facilities throughout the region where recyclables are still mostly being exported. In terms of the human capital, it remains sound, but we do still have this overall need for us to develop our sustainable financing mechanisms to enable, as you've mentioned, things moving forward. Another key point on this is also that, there are a slew of ongoing and planned initiatives in the region that are tackling several aspects of these things, but across the board, regional collaboration and coordination of the finance flow that we have is something that we recognize we need to actively work on. Then in terms of the examples of policies or financing mechanisms that's having an impact, we have the working examples, but I'd say we need some more time to better develop monitoring and evaluation systems to speak to direct impact of policies and financing mechanisms. In several instances, these are at the incipient stage. And so we do have qualitative observations that spoke to single-use plastic bans in some countries and all of that. But this is tying back to the need for, I think, improved data collection, monitoring, and evaluation in the region. The last point I have here is interesting, more of a positive observation to share, in that we are seeing more and more initiatives and uptake being driven by the private sector for us, such as tourism industry, where the value of our regional economies, of course, and the threat of plastic waste is being acknowledged or recognized at that level. So those are the few points I had to start. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel. So maybe staying in this part of the world, Julian, going back to the questions that I asked of Swaroop and Rajesh about India, what does the policy environment look like in Colombia? And, from your perspective, what's working in terms of driving investment towards recycling and more broadly addressing plastic waste in the country, and what more needs to happen to fight plastic waste?
Okay. Well, hi, Michael. Thank you for having me. Well, Colombia has been moving pretty actively when it comes to public policy and regulations. In the last 5 years, we've implemented EPR laws and systems, recycled content mandates, single-use plastic packaging bans, even taxes on virgin plastics, which is still something that's pretty theoretical, but we're moving towards it. I think that will definitely, each of these different components move different levers. I mean, the EPR mandates are really gonna move everything that is collection oriented. I think it's more targeted on that. I think there's a lot that has to do with traceability mandates that have been coming up. How can we guarantee things are recycled? But I agree with Rob and what my other panelists were saying that the recycled content mandates should be what really drive investment in the region, because as an organic market, I think there's a long road for plastic recycling to reach the scale it needs on its own. We still need to compete with virgin resin. I mean, I know there are plenty of intentions to go sustainable, but if it doesn't make sense from the economic standpoint, a lot of the time that decision kind of falls by its own weight. Recycled content mandates, on the other hand, are really what can uncouple the relationship between virgin and recycled resin. And that way, maybe we can go into a market that can allow us to actually scale, to invest in higher quality production capacities. Because as things are, it's really difficult for recycling companies to actually compete with virgin. So there are a lot of things that I think recycling companies can do if the virgin price ceiling was eliminated. I understand sometimes this implies additional cost for the actual consumer packaged good companies, but it is somewhat of a market failure if we don't address it. As things are, it's very difficult to compete with the petrochemical companies. It's just it is going to be a cheaper alternative than recycled products. So how can we actually provide better quality, better traceability, invest in those things that make PCR resin such a high value product if we have price constraints from virgin plastic? So I really think the recycled content mandate should boost the investment coming into the region and into the industry.
Yeah, and Julian, there was a question about how can you prove a healthy return on investment and profit in recycling when you don't have a supportive policy environment. And I think if I can infer from what you're saying, like it's hard to compete against virgin without a policy environment that tries to level the playing field, right, for recycled versus virgin.
Definitely. I mean, recycling started many years ago as the cheaper alternative to virgin plastics. I'm not talking about maybe flexibles, which is what we do. The only reason, let's say 10, 15 years ago, companies were interested in recycled resin is because of the opportunity it could be a cheaper alternative to virgin. I think that's changing. I think companies are showing a real legit interest in their plastic footprint and what they do as a brand. But still, I mean, they do run a business, and businesses have to make sense from the economic standpoint. Correct. So I think there's still a bridge we need to build around, how can we make sustainability more economically feasible, or when we do that, investment will come. I mean, there's no shortage of investment in the tech industry. Why? Because there's a return. So I think once these policies allow recycling companies to be more attractive in the return side, investment will follow.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. Thank you. Essa, so just to bring you in here, so with support from Global Environment Facility, UNEP and WWF recently launched Plastic Reboot to address plastic pollution through upstream and midstream solutions. And we've gotten a number of questions in the Q&A about the policy environment and how do we support and increase investment there. And I know it's early days for Reboot, but would love to hear, how are you thinking about the enabling environment for things like reuse and refill in the countries that are within scope of the program? Are there things that are already in place in these countries? And if not, like, what are some of the things that Reboot is trying to address to really make refill and reuse successful in these countries?
Thank you very much, and of course, thanks for having me. It's very important to say that I'm here to present the GEF partnership that is working on plastics, basically the whole stakeholders that are part of this integrated program on trying to find solutions for plastic pollution. And that involves the GEF Secretariat, the countries, 15 of them, and of course, the agencies and national stakeholders. You're very right. We've just launched in April, and this is not something that just started out of nowhere. There's been a lot of groundwork over the past couple of years to bring this into a reality that we managed to launch recently. So everybody's been working hard to figure out what actually it takes to do a shift in the system. Not just manage the symptoms that we have, which is plastic leaching into the environment, the ecosystems, in the ways that we see it across the globe. We are an enabler, I would like to say, and of course we're working across the 15 countries at the global scale, and we're not starting from zero. Many of the countries have EPR laws, have bans in place, have national strategies, have fiscal instruments. The building blocks are there. What's often missing, and I think Rachel mentioned it, is the alignment. We have a lot of fragmentation. We need a bit more clarity as well, and bring it all together. This is exactly what the Plastic Reboot is doing. We're talking about 108 million of GEF financing, and that financing is also attracting co-financing, hundreds of millions of additional co-financing that is meant to be speaking the same language, which is defined in the program and in the work we set to do. So we're working closely with governments that are ready to move. We have, I think, global momentum. I mean, we're talking about INC coming in. So this is the trend. We're all talking about plastic pollution here. So we're really trying to find the conditions for scaling up. And I think I just want to say back to the slide Elena showed in the beginning, which is the bulk of financing seems to be going downstream. And this is why the program, acknowledging this fact, is now focused more on upstream, midstream. So we're not trying to do work at the lowest part, because in terms of awareness campaigns on cleanup efforts, as important as that is, we want to be focused more on policies, data systems, financial tools, and business models. And that links up to work on the policy side. So we're trying to have a bit more sort of, to say, clarity in terms of regulation. As I said, there are a lot of regulations, a lot of rules and policies in place across the 15 countries. What we're trying to do is ensure that turning this intent into businesses that businesses can trust, and governments can apply, and investors can underwrite. Philippines have a lot currently. Morocco, Senegal, South Africa, they all have laws in place. We're trying to help improve. We're trying to close the gaps, and we're trying to see how to enforce and maybe implement. And at the same time, we want to work with the private sector and all of the businesses to ensure how they can adapt to such regulations and rules when and if they get into the enforcement that we hope for at some point. And there's a very important part as well that I'm very excited about. I think this links to Julian now, what he's been talking about in terms of what's the value. I think you cannot rescale, reuse, or refill or redesign if you can't really show that they're making an impact. And the impact we're talking about is not only about the environment, it's also about the financial returns. So in terms of cost savings, in terms of revenues from reuse, supply chain efficiency, and the rest of it. And the program is also talking a lot and working a lot, hopefully, with the private-public sort of collaboration. We're going to be working a lot in bringing in tax incentive guidelines, financial guidelines, incentive mechanism, the rest of it. And that is basically to ensure from the private sector side, we're able to bring both to the table to find ways in which they can engage in ways that actually can make sense for everybody. There is coordination gaps across ministries in the countries. You have ministries of environment, you have ministries of industries, you have finance ministry. So there's a bit of fragmentation that I think we're going to be working on a lot. And there's also a lot of room for improvement with regards to engaging with the private sectors, with investment on the area of circularity. On the other side, as we talk about it, when we work with the private sector, there seems to be a lot of interest in investing, but finding bankable projects, finding investing opportunities is something that we can work on, bringing it to the fore so that it can be visible and it can demonstrate that it's actually worth investing. Also answering questions to the investors. Is it legal? Is it a stable demand? Will the rules change? So all of these things work hand in hand, policy work, the data, the metrics, and then working on the finance aspects. And this leads me to talking about a very important thing, is that all of this might sound good in theory, but this is not only that. We have a lot of pilot work that is scheduled to take place in the countries to ensure that we actually test these things that we're going to put forward as guidelines. A lot of work, a lot of pilots in Philippines, in Brazil, in Senegal, in Costa Rica. And the beauty of the GEF work is that it's facilitating learning across the countries. So basically, when Brazil figures out a tax incentive, South Africa can actually learn from that. It does not need to start from zero. So is Cambodia, for instance, can learn about reuse from Costa Rica. So we're allowing pilot at the national level and then creating a platform for all of the countries to come together to learn what worked, what did not work, how to improve things and how to tweak things to ensure that we actually have a change, a transformative change that we actually need to move away from the problem. And finally, I would like to say that I think that we have a lot of partners. We have UNEP, which is part of the UN group that is part of the program UNIDO, UNDP. We are a convening power, and we bring in everybody to the table, starting from private sector, starting from investors, to really try to find a way in which we can all move together to a future that we all want for everybody. So we're all launching, we're all starting, I think, strong. The money, this is not something that we're talking about in terms of money in the future. This is actually investment money that is being injected now into these solutions to see what works. The plan is to work hard over the next 5 to 7 years, and of course continue with the GEF replenishments, with everybody that is willing to join us. We have lots of platforms, lots of ways to engage with the private sector, governments, stakeholders at all levels, and everybody is invited to join us in this amazing work. Thank you.
Excellent. That's and we will come back to the reuse, refill, upstream piece. But one topic that is critical, and a few folks have referenced this on the Q&A, and this is really a question for Swaroop and Julian and Rajesh, if you'd like to weigh in, around the informal sector and the critical role that it plays in addressing plastic waste in many countries, including Colombia and India. And so maybe Swaroop, to start with you, from your perspective, how are India's policies ensuring that waste pickers are a central part of the transition to a circular economy and that they benefit from it?
Well, in fact, post the global plastics treaty negotiations during Busan, there has been a inclusion in terms of the waste pickers identity, and then Indian government is working on a identification of these waste pickers across different strata in different cities. So which net again, there has been an enormous amount of active enrollment, and there's a special scheme being developed by the government of India, which is called the Namaste scheme, which forms part of the integration of these waste pickers into the mainstream plastic value chain. So that actually also would be a kind of learning phase where now we would see these informal waste pickers who were quite invisible or unknown in terms of their identity would start with their identity, and then that's where the place comes in. So that's a starting step, or the first step is what we see in the country. And more so, there have been certain projects, independent projects, which are been working on inclusion of these waste pickers into the mainstream plastic value chain. And supported by Coca-Cola, one of the projects is launched by the Circulate Initiative and Circulate Capital with Sri Chakra, where we are working on identifying the entire value chain across all tiers to identify these waste pickers as part of our responsible sourcing initiative project. That said, there is also a advocacy and policy framing group from the United Nations Development Program, in fact, where they are also trying to convene kind of insights on how to integrate the waste pickers into the mainstream. And this might take shape with a better clarity over the next 1 to 2 years is what we see. So that said, I think there is definite amount of acknowledgement that the waste pickers' value to the entire value chain or the supply chain today is being recognized by the government in our country.
Fantastic. Rajesh, if you have anything to add, would welcome that from an Indian context.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Michael. Vijay took away a lot of my talking points, but having said that, see, as a brand, we recognize that the informal waste pickers, the ecosystem that exists is very important, and we don't want to disturb it. But our effort is actually to strengthen it, because we realize that unless we don't strengthen that system, we don't give them access to the schemes, to the facilities that are already there on board, but which they are not able to access because of lack of documentation, lack of knowledge, lack of awareness. That is something which is very important. That's one point. The second point is that when it comes to any supply chain, as far as our ingredients are concerned, whether it is probably you can talk about sugarcane, you can talk about fruit pulp, you can talk about rPET. So rPET currently is a new ingredient which has walked into our supply chain system. So to get the same level of due diligence to ensure that those supply chains are equally safe and bereft of any kind of, I would say, non-compliance as far as a big brand is concerned is equally important. So that is where I think the pilot project that we have worked along with Sri Chakra as far as rPET is concerned, but it's just a starting point, because Sri Chakra is not going to be the only supplier to a large brand like Coca-Cola. We will be partnering with many more recyclers. So we will have to ensure that the same level of due diligence, the same level of compliance is there with all our recycling partners. And that's where the bigger challenge lies.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Great.
something which we are going to be working upon.
Excellent. Thank you, Rajesh. And Julian, same question for you in Colombia about the role of the informal sector, and how do we make sure that they are incorporated in this and benefit from this transition?
Well, actually, I think Colombia is a global leader when it comes to the to recognizing waste pickers as a key part of the solution. Actually, Colombia recognizes waste pickers as providers of public sanitation services by law. They are actually municipalities must include waste picker cooperatives into their how do you call it, into the public services agenda. So they must be involved in whenever in the public services strategy for each of the municipalities. That being said, you know, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in order to really boost their I think their productivity, their how they can maybe modernize and meet the demands of the industry. And what I mean by this is, you know, are the working conditions appropriate? Is the traceability there? And that's where I think maybe these EPR programs are really, they kind of bringing in some benefits that weren't necessarily mixed into the equation, because they have started to maybe adopt these cooperatives and provide structure, provide education, provide maybe a more formal work environment, where I think it's the biggest transition we need to make. Because even though the government can say, hey, we need to involve waste pickers into the equation, there's still a lot of gaps that need to be filled. I'm really sure that's all filled with good intentions, but that there is a lot of legal things that need to be resolved. Like, do they have access to healthcare programs that every worker in Colombia must have? Do they have access to pensions, to housing programs that every employee in Colombia should have? So I think we're getting there, and the notion that the government has included them in every as providers of a public sanitation service kind of boosts companies to move in that direction. So I think that the Colombian government has done a good job of taking that first step. And I think it's up to the private sector to make basically two things. One is create demand for actual classified waste, because it's more volume or maybe better prices can really make these waste picking cooperatives, take a step forward. And second is, which I think is really important, is the traceability and certification programs. I think brand owners need some kind of assurance that they're not at risk from a compliance standpoint, and that everything is being responsibly sourced. And so I think those two things should be our focus moving forward.
Great. Excellent. Questions are coming in really strongly, so thank you everyone for putting your questions. We're trying to address these live, and we will pause in a moment to ask the panelists. But Rachel, you've had an initial portfolio of grant recipients. I'm curious if there are any themes that you're seeing in the grants that you're making, and then also how are you seeing reuse and refill show up in the SIDS context? I think there's this perception that reuse and refill maybe should work more in island states, for example, versus larger, maybe landlocked countries, right? So what are you seeing, and how are you seeing refill reuse?
Good, thank you. So this is our Advancing Circular Economy facility at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. For the context here, we are just moving from our first call for proposals in the region into the second. So we're just at that juncture where we're examining how things went for the first call to then position ourselves a bit better to meet the needs of the region as we move into the second call. So as it is right now, we have several initiatives that range from implementers in different sectors. We were keen on seeing a multi-sectoral approach and spreading the initiatives. So we have private sector SMEs, the tourism sector came in strong, the public sector is also there. NGOs, CBOs, and academia also have some reach in some of the interventions. In terms of the trends, we have a few projects that are looking at policy and enabling environment with a focus on the regulatory reform that's required, extended producer responsibility, but more the national or sub-regional approach is being explored. And we have some national action plans there to then inform policy later on. We have a few initiatives looking at waste collection, recycling, and material recovery. This would be to improve plastic recovery systems and introducing scalable recycling solutions at the national and then also the regional level. We have some circular product innovation and alternative materials being looked at with alternatives to single-use plastics and valorizing waste streams. And then across the board, we asked for how sustainability and improved awareness and behavior change can be built into interventions. So we have quite a bit on awareness, behavior change, and community engagement, looking at education at the community, school level, and behavior change at the commercial sector also. One of the key things we've seen is that we have a lot of public-private partnerships built in via co-implementing and co-financing mechanisms, because we're working towards blending the grant financing and looking towards sustainability there. So we have a very strong also social inclusion into the design of several of the interventions, where the youth, women, and the informal sector are also key beneficiaries to the work. For us also, I just wanted to mention that we recognize that we need to see a bit more systemic financing instruments being mechanized as we move forward. So our future calls would work on that, and also we're looking at striking a balance with those upstream solutions, because we've seen a bit more of requests for downstream pilots. In terms of reuse and refill, so we do have two initiatives that are considering reuse, mostly in the HoReCa industry. One is actually looking at scaling some Central American technology, so it's a bit innovative, and scaling it throughout the region in the restaurant and hotel industry there. I think overall for us, we recognize that reuse and refill systems are a powerful circular economy tool or lever that can be used in the SIDS context, but we're cognizant, I'd say, that the success depends on considering our context and the constraints that we have as island economies. We rely on imports. We're very waste export dependent right now, so we need to consider that. But we have small markets, we have the economies of scale to consider, and reverse logistics is still a challenge for us, logistics on the whole, as you know, in the region. So we need to consider all of that. And then we do also have cultural perspectives, hygiene concerns to consider that are very much still strong in the region. So those are the few points there. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. And Rob, just to build on that, I mean, you all have looked at investments in upstream solutions, and based on how you opened the call, I probably can answer this for you, but like, what are some of the things that you are seeing, and what has to be in place to make refill reuse attractive from an investment perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. A few years ago, we launched Circulate Capital Disrupt, a dedicated pool of capital to invest in innovations upstream. Most of our capital is dedicated to the downstream recycling supply chains, but we recognize that there were opportunities and needs in the transition to the circular economy to help invest in some of these upstream solutions, and reuse and refill fits in that category. So we've reviewed many dozens of such investment opportunities across our different markets in Latin America and Asia. And unfortunately, we just haven't really seen the economic case work out. We hear lots of pilots. I would say that almost all of these companies are stuck in pilot purgatory. And the challenge is, how do we get them out of this pilot purgatory and into scale? This challenge is at the heart of the circular economy. We've spent decades and billions of dollars building a linear economy, and it's a one-way system. It's extremely efficient and cost-effective. And when we start thinking about a reuse and refill model, you're just not able to compete on costs. And also the systems are so localized. So we have to build a system that works in one local environment and then replicate that across many, many different localizations. And you can't leverage the existing supply chain to do that, which we can in recycling. You have to completely build a new system. So we've come to a point where, we still look at every deal we can, because we're desperate to find ways to deploy capital into that sector and very passionate about it. Some policy incentives that I think could be on the table that could help to make these models more investable and more scalable are like sales tax reductions, or ways to make it more cost competitive to do reuse from a consumer perspective, so that the consumer who's choosing between a reuse model that is less convenient than a single-use model, they're at least cost competitive. And some of the other ideas we've seen contemplated, but not actually seen implemented in any way, believe me, is around like when policymakers are thinking about trying to cap virgin or disincentivize virgin in some ways, they give credit for using recycled content. They give credit for reducing your amount of virgin use. They could give credit for reuse models in some of those policy systems. So again, an economic case to make that work. But we've yet to see some of those startups really get to the point where our capital could help them scale.
Yeah, great. And again, maybe this requires just a different form of funding for these organizations, public money, et cetera. So in the interest of time, and Christian will kind of close us off in a moment, there's a good question in the thread about, multi-layered packaging, so-called harder to recycle material. Anyone on the panel, like, how is the policy in India or Colombia or anywhere else, like, addressing that particular problem? Any thoughts from India? Like, how is your aggressive content mandate and EPR addressing multi-layer and other hard to recycle material? Could be India, could be Colombia, but would love a thought.
I can jump in if it's okay.
Go for it, Julian. Yep.
I think for now, EPR packaging laws in Colombia are not really going into specifics about what kind of packaging you're using. I think we're going to start dividing into different categories in the near future. I'm talking 1 to maybe 3 years down the road, because I do know it is being discussed. And that would mean that, if right now companies really don't have any incentive to think about the recyclability of their products, because everything falls into one big bucket when it comes to EPR, then I don't think we're really going to see a shift. I think EPR will play a really big role when they get really specific, if it's rigids, then if it's single layers, if it's multi-layers, then we will see maybe companies reassess how much they really do need those multi-layer packaging, because I'm confident that's most of the times it is the case. But there are also other things that I think the industry will kind of catch up. I do think these packages will, over time, maybe the packaging converters will migrate to friendlier inks or friendlier adhesives, because it's not only, can they be recycled? Sometimes they can. It just is there a market for them?
Yeah.
What do you do once you recycle them? Because the irony of the situation is, the more expensive the packaging,
Yeah.
the less value there is once you recycle it. So how can we actually turn this around? So I think there is a market restriction on multi-layer packaging that we need to fix for this to actually work.
Great. There was a question/comment about having a standard around EPR. And I think the question is, couldn't you just replicate what's working in a place globally? I don't know if anyone wants to take on that. Obviously, EPR is very context specific. To get countries to collaborate on specific policies is a challenge, maybe as we're seeing in this current trade environment. But I don't know if anyone has a thought on making policy consistent around EPR globally. Asa, I don't know if that's something you're looking at from Reboot's perspective, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think one that speaks exactly to what we're trying to do to some extent.
Yeah.
Obviously, the plastic reboot is all about solutions that work at the national level, and then scaling upwards to see what can be replicated elsewhere. So we really have this exciting working groups, and the point is we have one on EPR. We want to bring in the 15 countries. And also extended stakeholders to see what seems to be working and at what level. And we have the capacity to bring that into a global sort of a platform to ensure that we have a cross-learning, and we have even beyond the 15 countries, that to show the world that, okay, this aspect worked here, this aspect did not work there. So the program, I think, is quite ready and in place to examine and empower at the local scale, and then scale up at the global level as more countries are potentially interested in moving towards that direction.
Great. Excellent.
Just to
Go for it,
build
Rob.
on that, I do think there's probably 10 levers that can make an EPR policy work well. And how you pull those levers and to what extent you pull those levers in each market does vary. I think there is good work that's been done by the Plastic Reboot group that they're trying to do, and Consumer Goods Forum has done standards on this. But we have found that it is much more difficult than it sounds. India launched EPR over a decade ago. It's probably changed 10 times in 10 years. So every year they continue to expand and learn and modify and change and adapt. So there are principles that you can align on, but implementation in any given market does vary.
Yep. Yep. Excellent. So with that, I just want to thank the panelists for a fantastic discussion about enablers. We see lots of questions. We will try to address them post-webinar. I think we've addressed some of those now, but I think this is a good segue to Christian to close us out as we look towards INC 5.2 in Geneva. So Christian, over to you to wrap things up.
Thank you very much, Michael, and also a big thank you from us at the World Economic Forum and the Global Plastic Action Partnership for this great selection of panelists here and the great questions and discussion. So thanks everyone. Also a big thank you for all the members of the Financing Coordination Group, OECD, the World Bank, UNEP FI, the TCI team. Thanks for moderating and the great execution of this webinar again. This is the kind of conversation that the FCG wants to continue replicating in the context, of course, of the INC process, with, as you just mentioned, Michael, a touch point coming up in August in Geneva in conjunction with that negotiation round in Geneva. I'll share some information on that. In fact, if you're interested to attend our FCG session in August, which will be on August 3rd in the morning, you can reach out to us, and my colleague Tasnima will put into the chat some information so that you can get in touch with us and register. I can't do justice to the wealth of different topics and insights that were shared today, but I think a few key themes came up that we will also hone in deeper in Geneva on the 3rd of August. This relates to this question around the enabling environment, in particular the policy questions. We heard a lot around recycled content and EPR, for example, and removing regulatory barriers for circular solutions. We will feature a few case studies in Geneva on August 3rd, bringing that to life with specific country examples from some of our partner countries, the GPAP network, but also from other organizations and initiatives. We heard a lot about the upstream versus downstream trade-offs and the imbalance there. And I think what we will also talk about on August 3rd is that financing solutions look very different depending on where you are in the value chain, in terms of what are, let's say, more incremental investments to the existing system, especially downstream investments versus new business models and more disruptive and riskier investments in the upstream space. And so I think we'll also be able to dive deeper into that with some great examples from financial institutions and innovators and others working in these different parts of the value chain. You also heard, Julian mentioned this, the macroeconomic context around the price gaps between virgin and recycled, and we'll also shed light on the macroeconomic contexts of some of these challenges that are so fundamental, because if we don't address those major imbalances at the macroeconomic level, some of the solutions will never see the viability and the day of light. So looking forward to that as well. And finally, I just want to highlight again the importance of the informal sector piece and inclusive financing. This was also brought up in the chat. We'll actually have a dedicated session late morning that day on the inclusive financing and shedding light in particular on the informal sector, but also SMEs and their needs to fulfill some of those requirements and enabling conditions for attracting investment. So these are just, I think, some of the highlights coming out of today that we will dive deeper in Geneva in August. But of course, tying it very much to this huge historic opportunity of the treaty that can really move the needle on financing it's a historic moment to scale resources for this cause. And I guess closing the circle here to loop back to what Elena from the OECD was talking about early on. It's really an opportunity for not just thinking about the financing mechanism in terms of ODA and public and multilateral funds being available to catalyze investment and address some of the implementation costs that the treaty will present, but also what is really the broader opportunity for the treaty to unlock the enabling conditions that can, in terms of policy, standards, transparency, data, reporting, and so on, that can ultimately mobilize the broader private sector financing that will move the needle on circularity for plastics. So with that, we hope that to see many of you in Geneva, and I just want to say a huge thank you again to Michael and the TCI team and my colleague Tasnima for putting together this great webinar, and thanks to all the panelists and participants. Michael, back to you. Thank you.
Excellent. And thank you everyone for bearing with us as we went a bit over. But just to reiterate my thanks to the panelists, to Elena and Christian and Tasnima and Shamina, everyone that was involved in putting this together. We will follow up with the recording, with the slides, and we tried to address a number of your questions, and we'll try to address others after the webinar. So really appreciate your engagement and wish you a good day and good evening wherever you are in the world. So thank you.